Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 today. Now, the first verse of Ecclesiastes chapter 8, honestly, is a bit strange. It says this: "Who is like the wise man? Who knows the explanation of things? Wisdom brightens a man's face and changes its hard appearance." So that's good insight. I would say, bottom line, wisdom can make you happier. But then there's this whole pivot into talking about following the king's command. Now, what I want to note here is that the end of chapter 7, which ends in verse 29, and the first verse in chapter 8, in the original writings, they didn't have the chapter breakouts. And so I'll just throw this out. Maybe it would have been better to put chapter 8, verse 1 as chapter 7, verse 30. It just kind of stands out strangely. While it does connect into living wisely, which is a theme throughout the book, it just struck me as kind of an odd phrase, but let's not miss the truth there. Wisdom brightens a man's face and changes its hard appearance. Living wisely leads to goodness and joy and happiness. And we saw that in the last chapter, that there's a foolishness to wickedness and there's a joy in living wisely. All right, continuing on, it says, "Obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, 'What are you doing?'" Then he continues, he says, "Whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a man's misery weighs heavily upon him." Now, we don't live in a time with kings in the same way that they did back in this time, but the point here is that when you're in the king's presence, be wise as you communicate. And in particular, that last sentence, it says, "For there's a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a man's misery weighs heavily upon him." I want to give you a truth that is certainly applicable within the context when we're speaking to the king, but I think it's a truth we can apply throughout all of our lives, which is, if we feel deep emotions about things, in this example, great sadness, maybe it's anger, maybe it's frustration, we need to be careful when we speak. And there's a time to speak wisely about something and a time that is not wise to speak about something. If we are feeling deep emotions, if our hearts are heavy, like it says in this text, we shouldn't just blurt out, "Oh, this is what I'm feeling." We should think, we should slow down. The last chapter reminds us not to jump into anger. So let us be wise people, whether we're talking to the king or to others, and say, "Let me not be driven, God, by my anger, my frustration, my sadness, such that I speak foolishly." Let's speak with wisdom. And part of that wisdom is to say, if my heart is heavy, if my heart is angry, let me slow down, take a deep breath, and think about what's the best time and way to express what's happening inside of me. That's a clear truth that we can pull out of this opening section of chapter 8. Continuing on in verse 7, it says, "Since no man knows the future, who can tell him what is to come? No man has power over the wind to contain it. So no one has power over the day of his death, and no one is discharged in time of war. So wickedness will not release those who practice it." There's just a reality in this life that there are certain things that have a grasp over us that controls us. We don't have control over the day that we die. We don't have control over the future. And also, when we get into places of pursuing wickedness, it won't release us. It has a grasp on us, and it won't let us go. Think about that. Death, we don't have control over it. And when wickedness controls us, we don't have control over it as well. Let us run away from wickedness and pursue righteousness. The author here is going to turn to talking about his frustration with the wickedness of the world and people prospering even though they're wicked, and that the wicked and the righteousness, they both die at the end. And so he says in verse 9, "All this I saw as I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There is a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Then too I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come up and go from the holy place and receive praise." And he concludes and says, this too is meaningless. So let me just encourage you, again, we've looked at this in earlier chapters, but when you see wicked people prospering and you feel like this is meaningless, what's the point of this all? Wicked people are getting ahead. It's okay to feel that way, and know that other people, biblically, the biblical authors, have felt that same way. Continuing on in verse 11, he says, "When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the hearts of the people are filled with schemes to do wrong." There's a truth right there that says when we see people do wrong and they don't get punished for it, we go like, well, what's the point of doing right? Now, that's not the right way to live, but it is part of the response of our own hearts. And then he continues, he says, "Although a wicked man commits 100 crimes and still lives a long time, I know that it will go better with God-fearing men who are reverent before God." Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. So again, the theme pops up is that there's a foolish way to live, and that's wickedness, and it's going to end up harming you, and there's a right way to live, and that will end up leading to more goodness. He says right here, I know that it's better with God-fearing men. Live properly, live righteously, and it will go better with you than people who are living wickedly. Now, again, he's already expressed this is not always the case, but in general, he still comes back to that principle that that's a way God has designed the world. Verse 14, there is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. Righteous men who get what the wicked deserve, and wicked men who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless. So I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him in his work all the days of his life God has given him under the sun. The author is saying exactly that. I've seen good men get bad stuff. I've seen bad men get good stuff. It feels crazy. So enjoy life. Enjoy what you have right in front of us now. Jesus emphasizes this in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, sufficient is each day with its own trouble. There's enough to deal with today. Let's not spend time worrying about all the things that might go wrong in the future. Enjoy what God has put right in front of you today. He closes and says, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe man's labor on earth, his eyes not seeing sleep day or night, then I saw all that God had done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all his efforts to search it out, man cannot discover its meaning. Even if a wise man claims he knows it, he cannot really comprehend it. I'll just end this section by saying that at the end of chapter 8, the author feels like just throwing his hands in the air and saying, no one's going to figure it out. Even if they say they do, they haven't. Now, as we do every week, I want to gospelize this text. How do we think about this in light of Jesus? And I want to really focus on this idea of righteousness and evil, or righteousness and wickedness. In light of eternity, in light of Jesus, living righteously will never, ever go without its final reward. And living wickedly will never, ever go unpunished. Because of eternity, because of the righteous God we serve, people who live wickedly will one day have to face judgment for that. And people who live righteously will one day receive blessing for that. Friends, that changes everything. Because when you live righteously and you don't get the reward for it, you don't have to go, it doesn't make sense, it's not worth it. It is worth it, because your righteousness will be rewarded in light of eternity. And last chapter, the focus was on, hey, we got to keep death in mind. Because if you keep death in mind, you'll have a proper perspective. We're all going to die and face God one day. The author of Ecclesiastes in a moment like this will go like, who cares if you live righteously? It's not going to make a difference in the end. But the Apostle Paul, in light of the resurrection of Jesus, would say, do not grow weary in doing good, because in the right time, God will bear fruit from that. God will bring forth what you have poured into. He will bring forth a blessing from that effort. The author of Ecclesiastes is right. If we live just under the sun without eternity in mind, then it does feel meaningless, because the righteous don't always prosper, and the wicked sometimes do, and what do I do with that? But because of Jesus, righteousness always, always matters. Thanks for tuning in as the sun comes beaming in here. Blessings to you as you head to your small groups. We'll see you in the next video.